So for my video kind of muddy point s creative project is this little video format, just kind of briefly outlining and going over um, my general thoughts of the book. And I remember I did this last time I had Professor Maddox as my professor, and we would discuss Middlemarch, Anna Karenina, and ironically enough, also The Good Soldier. So this feels a tad reminiscent in that sense. The only difference being, compared to the last time I did this, I was filming in my cramped little dorm room at the L, and now I'm in my backyard of a house I'm renting. So I do apologize for any noise in advance from traffic and whatnot. But I think a great place to start with The Good Soldier, generally speaking, is by first examining what exactly the Good Soldier brings to the class, right? What exactly makes the Good Soldier the relevant title that it is within literary circles, right? And I think when it comes to examining that very question, a great place to start is by asking ourselves, what exactly is the theme of the class, right? Well, the theme of the class is on bullshit, as the class is promptly titled. And I think when I first heard that this class was being titled as such, I was intrigued. It was a class that, to me, was willing to ask questions, to speak an uncomfortable truth to an unsavory reality, right? That sometimes people lead more than they let on. And that, unfortunately, sometimes folks can have motives or hidden agendas, or generally speaking, be perhaps unreliable in some senses. And as that relates to the book, I think of our main character, Dole, being just that, being an unreliable narrator. And I think this construct, an idea of unreliable narrators and literary storytelling in general, following this sort of structure, I find it quite intriguing. It's certainly a bit of parting from your typical linear storytelling models. So I think for me, in that sense, it feels a tad different than normal. But it was also quite refreshing once you get past that initial hurdle of perhaps not being able to exactly follow along with what might happen in a story. As we progress throughout the story and we start to get a better picture as to who all of the characters, not just Dowell, but everyone else, including the Ashburnhams, and many others that we get to know throughout the story, I think one thing is eerily familiar, and that is this human precept in my mind that I don't feel like we necessarily talk about a whole lot with the book, but is a human precept of us coming up with alternative versions of what an actual reality is in our lives, when the moment that we happen to be in is maybe less than savory or favorable to us. There's been a lot of theories that we have discussed in class regarding Dowell and regarding his dogmatic approach to storytelling, but one thing that stuck out to me throughout all of those discussions was this theme of crisis that takes place in the background of all of these theories. It's no secret that the book focuses in and around the extramarital affairs and scandalous behavior of all of the characters that we come to know throughout the book. And while I'm not here to make a judgment as to the morality of that, I certainly hold the opinion that I think it certainly comes out of a place of crisis, at least that's how I pretend to understand it. I think when I look at Edward, for example, kind of the main culprit of this very thing, um, I see a man who is afraid of reality, is afraid of connection, and is afraid of intuition, of promises, of long-term goals, and is afraid of settling down. And in some ways, I think that's eerily familiar to the college experience, for where folks like myself in our lives are maybe at right now. Of perhaps trying to savor those last few moments of just doing college things, right? Of um, not being bogged down or held back by long-term promises, or virtuoso, so to speak, but are instead living these very carefree, nonchalant lives that don't particularly have a whole lot of consequence or weight to them, but are in themselves pretty lighthearted affairs and matters. And I feel like Edward, throughout the book, goes through that very experience, even though he may not be my exact age. I think what's interesting to highlight is the title itself, The Good Soldier, right? It's documented throughout the book that Edward was himself a soldier. And it's also well documented that many soldiers come back not just with unbelievable amounts of trauma, but with a different perspective and outlook, and perhaps a different character than they were before the war, before their service in the forces. And I don't think that goes without coincidence. I think there is an inextricable link between the way that we as people think and the way that we perceive the world, and the ways in which that perception can change at the sight of traumatic things such as war, such as armed service. And I think Edward is someone who, like everyone else, was just as impacted and just as traumatized by the war, but perhaps in a little bit of a different light than most folks would likely go through. I think when we think of trauma, we tend to box trauma up into, at least in regards to war, as activities such as PTSD, of sensory overload or sensory issues, to things like fireworks, or gunshot-like noises, which, while certainly true, and while certainly not something that we should discredit as a society, and should continue to do research and funding, as thanks to our armed servicemen and women across the world, and their sacrifice to all of us, I do think it is a little bit unfair and perhaps incredulous to leave trauma as just that, when trauma can come in many different forms and shapes and sizes. And I think for Edward, that comes in the form of love. I cannot imagine the kind of suffering that he must have gone through during the war. I think we as readers, perhaps intentionally, are left to put that together, are left to imagine what that might have been like. But I would like to imagine that, as it is in many cases for other folks who served in the armed forces, that Edward became fairly close with a lot of comrades throughout his time in the service, and saw those relationships that he started to garner in an unimaginable place of sorrow and despair and death and agony, turn into just that. To see those relationships suddenly come to an end at the sight of violence. And so I feel like there is a sense of pain that goes into that, right? And that's just one perspective, right? When we look at even Dowell's perspective of where he comes from, I think there needs to be a lot of sensitivity to that very point. I think we're very quick to judge Dowell as a character. And while he certainly is not exactly my favorite character, I could kind of understand where he is coming from a lot of the time. I understand where he's coming from in the sense that I too can sometimes, like Dowell, um, be left facing my own alternative reality, like I've touched on briefly with Edward. Um, I think the only difference between Dowell and Edward is obviously A, the war, um, but B, I think a change in perspective and who they are morally as characters. Edward, perhaps throughout his time in the war and even after, likely has a much different attitude, morally speaking, uh, to affairs, to scandal, to power, and to intrigue than Dowell does, which is totally understandable, um, as we all hold different opinions to one another. I think what's interesting to me about Dowell is this idea of being so discluded, but it's intentional, right? It's not as if all of the events that are happening around him throughout the book regarding his wife and Leonora and Edward and so on, they aren't just happening behind closed doors without his knowledge. He is very aware of what's going on, right? For one example, I think the most talked about case would be in the train car, right? Um, Dowell not only isn't paying attention to what's happening in front of his very eyes, and what he's present for, but he's so distant from this conversation and has such a perhaps morbid sense of humor because of what happens after that train ride, or perhaps during, if you look at the timeline in a different light. Because what goes on in that train, as we come to find out, is him getting such a laugh out of a fairly violent encounter between two cattle. And one of them ends up knocking the other one over, and it just sends Dowell into a tizzy, whilst his wife is actively making moves on Edward in front of him and Leonora. So I think that instances like that tend to show a side of Dowell that we maybe don't tend to look at in the right lens, right? Is Dowell likely in a different train of thought than most of us would be, should we ever be in that particular situation? Likely so. I don't know if I would probably be as drawn back as Dowell. I would probably be more present, would probably be more hurt that my wife is actively making moves on who I thought was my friend in Edward. So I think we all have a different train of thought in that sense, but I also think that there are other instances throughout the book that go to show that there is something more that we're missing as a reader, something intentional that we are not being told because of this very point of an unreliable narrator. And I couldn't say for certain what exactly that is. There have been some theories that suggest that Dowell was a deranged sociopath, someone who murdered many different characters, and many people point to that very instance of the two cattle as evidence of such morbid sense of humor, that he would find a sense of amusement even in such a violent encounter, if we're to be frank. But I don't know if I necessarily subscribe to that. What I would say is that Dowell certainly has a dramatically different perception of reality, and I think it's something that we as readers are both too quick to judge, and at the same time also right to raise questions about. But I think there needs to be a different tone to how those questions are raised, one that brings back a human element into the matter. The last point that I wanted to discuss was on Leonora. Leonora is, to me, probably my favorite character in the book. I don't particularly enjoy this book as a favorite, I must admit. So perhaps that statement doesn't come as a very gratuitous one, but uh, with all that being said, Leonora is still by far and away my favorite character. I think the reason why I feel the way I do about Leonora is I feel this strange sense of similarity, perhaps empathy, with Leonora and her alternative motives and goals that she aims to introduce and bring to discussion throughout the book. And I think I kind of tend to appreciate how socially and politically savvy she is throughout this novel. Not only does she keep Dowell in the loop throughout much of the book, but when she does keep Dowell in the loop, it's normally very selective. Um, it's never her showing all of her cards. If anything, it's her bluffing a lot of the time, out of the sense that she wants to gain something out of this, right? That the trauma that she has been inflicted upon by Edward throughout all of these extramarital affairs, by the draining of their finances, by all of the social dogma that has gone around for much of her marriage, and an arranged marriage at that, is something that I could not even begin to imagine feeling and walking in the same shoes as. So I understand where she's coming from, of being so cold cut and very precision-esque in her moves throughout the story, right? Of having this really straight and narrow idea of what she wants to accomplish throughout the book. Now that she realizes that attaining Edward's love is just more than a pipe dream. It is a simply unrealistic reality at this point. And so I think for Leonora, it's very much a set of moves that don't just preserve her image socially in the eyes of other people, but also see that she is well off personally by the time everything is said and done. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't exactly quite work out, but I think throughout much of the book, we as the reader tend to gain the understanding that what is happening before our eyes is Leonora slowly but surely creating a path in which she can inevitably cross and see that she's better off by the end of it. And I think her own downfall was this sense of naivety, of stubbornness, of self-assurance, of not exactly putting her trust in other people after she already put her trust in Edward once and felt betrayed. And while I can certainly understand where she's coming from in that sense, I think it's also quite tragic in another sense. It's something that we as a reader can tend to take away from this story, just thematically speaking, right? That we as people, regardless of how hard we try, of how much planning we might do, of how wise and as keenly aware as we might be regarding our lives and the very instances that we may encounter throughout them, we need to rely on other people as well to see that we are taken care of, that our needs are met, and to come to the realization that we are much stronger when in the presence of other people that we put our trust in and who they in turn put their trust in us. Overall, I think the book as a whole is quite a sad story. I know we discussed in length about the different titles that never actually made it to the press, about it being promptly called the saddest story you've ever heard. And while I understand why it was not titled as such given the particular time period, I will say it is quite tragic that it did so happen to be the case that it was not published as such, because I think the title does it justice, in a sense. Perhaps it's a bit on the nose, and perhaps it's a bit trivial, but this book really is a book in which we contemplate and wrestle with various outlooks and points of contention that we as humans will inevitably come to terms with, that we will have to wrestle with in order to find some sense of purpose and or peace. Um, and overall, while this may not be my favorite book, as I mentioned before, it's still a book that I can come to appreciate and value for its sense of nobility, for its sense of self-reflection into us as readers, and for making us as an audience question the very motives and morals of those that we hear stories from. And lastly, forces us to ask questions about perspective, about who we can relate to, about who we show empathy towards, and who we as people are within these very stories. So overall, I would say that this is a book that certainly deserves its place and relevance within literary society, and it's a book that I certainly hope other Watagans and future scholars read for years to come and come to wrestle with in the same way that all of us, this